Let me go ahead and put it on the screen really quick here, because I think it's relevant enough that we can go ahead and start to paint a picture here. So the principle is that we have the zayin, and then we have ikuf, and then we have a final nun. Okay, so that's the cane. And this actually needs to be a little bit longer. Okay, so that's the cane. And of course, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have the Madoc. We have the gathering of sunlight at the horizon, and we have the seed sprout. Now we know that this is actually the parent root, right? We know this. That's the parent root. So this additional letter is actually going to end up being the modifier of this, all right? So getting into the zayin, what we have, now I will remind you, this is going to be, the parent root is going to be open seed. And it was the sense of root. Root, okay? Open seed or root. And then on this side, we have the Madoc, which is basically the, it is a weapon or cutter for harvesting. And we can even equate that to seeds or harvest. Why? Because a lot of times the same blade that was used for fighting was the same blade that was used for harvesting. There wasn't really a designation of tools for one or the other. It was kept sharp, and you go wrong with it, you're going to end up, with the head of the grain removed or your head removed. But the principle here is now all of a sudden this becomes something very interesting, and it is different from this word, right? So this word kahan is priest, right? Kahan is priest, and it's specifically foundation, okay? Foundation. And was a pillar of the people, or the support of the people, a teacher of Torah, okay? And also, I'm going to get into this in a minute, a judge. And we're going to get into this. Okay, so now we have these two words having the same root because this is a cognate. You can go research what a cognate is. Okay, this is a cognate. And cognates are basically words that sound the same, but what's interesting is they kind of still maintain the same meaning. So what's the entire theme of all of this, right? The entire theme of all of this is contained in the word root. Root, okay? So, but it's in the principle of an elder versus a priest, right? Now, let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about the premise here, okay? A clan leader was not a president. He didn't have a senate, okay? He didn't have a group of people giving him an opinion about what he should do. Because if you were disobedient to the clan leader, done. You were cast out of the camp. Okay. And being outside the camp being a wall of tents on the outside that was protective, and people stood guard outside of that wall, making sure that nobody could come in and like cut through the back of the tent and make a raid. But the wall itself created a safe place for the families, and therefore that wall, of course, in the Hebrew is the chet, and the families being the offspring, the nun. Chet, nun is the word chan or chanan, being the stem from it, which is the word grace. And so if you went outside of the camp, then you were outside of grace. Okay. We'll get into that a little bit, but the principle is that if you did not obey the rules of the camp, you could not stay. Now, the default was hospitality, and so it was hard to get kicked out. But I can tell you that if you rose up against the clan leader who was decisive, he would cut you off, and you would be cut off from your people. So the principle of being cut off from your people is being pulled outside the camp. Okay. So in the culture of these nomadic peoples, that's how they thought and understood things. Now, the reason this is important is because you still have other people potentially even older than the clan leader. Why? Because the clan leader can potentially be the firstborn of the one who started the clan, and therefore now is in charge. Once the signet ring is passed to, and the staff is passed to the firstborn, then there is actually a principle of them being the agent of the clan leader, and therefore what their word is what is said. And the same principle applies to being kicked out of the camp, et cetera, only this time it's an agent of the clan leader, okay? Whoever has the signet ring and the staff. So there could be people in the camp older than that person. Those were the Zachanim, the elders, those, the old ones, the aged ones, those who were not able to come in and go out per se anymore. But it also stood for the judges of the camp. The principle is that every man in the group could make a decision about his own family in his own way, as long as it didn't violate the camp rules. The camp rules were developed over time as a result of experiences that had occurred. Okay. Now, as we get into this concept of these elders making these decisions individually, there's a point in time where it still all went back to one. Okay. But so somebody would come along and have these two elders or these two groups of people would have a dispute. So the leaders of those tents, or the leaders of the sub camps, as you were, because sometimes these camps were huge, that they would say, okay, we will decide this over, what's fair, etc. And so those elders were judges in that sense. Now, of course, we see the same premise being given in Leviticus to the priests, right? The priests have a deciding between one or the other, the high priest kind of being the Supreme Court justice leader, as it were. But I want you to understand this is not Western social democratic policy. The clan leader was king. It was not a situation where you could make a suggestion to him and now he's going to change his mind. If he says something, you do. And everybody in the camp does. Okay? Now, the elders themselves would make these decisions between these disputes, And of course, they would agree with each other and say, yeah, you know what? I agree with that. So from now on, let's make this policy. But if that policy ever violated the sovereignty of the clan leader, it was not a legal policy. Okay. All of this, interestingly enough, you can learn from studying the ancient Hebrew culture and language. The pictographs themselves and the culture itself has been preserved over time through various things. So the reason this is really important is because I want you to think about this. You have elders making decisions, okay? They're not necessarily the majority, but two elders get together and they make a decision to settle a dispute, or one elder settles a dispute between two people, and the other elder hears about it and agrees with that same decision. That is case law, right? Now, there was not a stare decisis, and I may have pronounced that incorrectly, but there was not a, if this judge says, therefore it stands, because this judge had the opportunity to actually make his own decisions and didn't have to honor that, okay? However, over time, there came a period in which the clans got larger and the elders would come together and they would cast a majority rule vote. By the time, and I'm gonna share this with you, I have a funny feeling like that transition occurred when Jacob went down to Egypt. Now, one of the reasons why I say this is because up until Jacob, they're nomadic. But we find archaeological evidence of housing, not tents, in Egypt. And yet when the Father delivers them out of Egypt, he brings them back into a nomadic lifestyle. He reintroduces them to this culture, which tells me that Abraham learned his culture and his practice from the Father and not from the nations around him. There may have been similar practices and there may have been certain ways that things happen, but you can already see Abraham never enters a city. He may have possibly entered a city to negotiate the cave of Machpelah with the Hittites. However, there is a premise that that probably wasn't the case because he never enters a city. He didn't even go into Salem. When Melchizedek came out and the king of Sodom comes out to the Valley of the Kings, he didn't even go to Salem. Okay, he stays a nomad. Now, in that process, then we maintain the culture of the nomad, and they're brought back into that as they're going to the wilderness. But here's the part that people miss in this parasha. The part that people miss in this parasha is the Zakanim are who Moses goes to present the proposal for leaving Egypt. And then after that, the people are convinced. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to follow an elder in their decision, because remember, in the clan itself, the eldership stood. But what you got to understand is in that process, there wasn't a democracy vote. Okay? There were decisions made about the fairness of something, but that wasn't necessarily honored from tent to tent. Now, what's interesting is that the word, the Hebrew letters Kof and the letter Resh, which we'll get into in a moment here, have the premise of men gathering around a fire. Now, what's intriguing about that is the concept that even though that the clan leader had absolute sovereignty, and I'm going to explain that a little bit in a second, he still met with the elders. As the sun was setting, they'd gather around the fire and they would discuss the conditions of the camp. Why? Because he was pastoral. The clan leader was pastoral. He was a shepherd. And shepherds have a natural tendency towards caring for their sheep. Okay, and so in that sense, he would check on the camp. He probably didn't have every single case brought to him, right? Now, what's intriguing is Moses has to learn this all over again when he gets out in the wilderness. But Abraham understood the sovereignty he had. And not only that, but the people who were with him and understood the sovereignty he had. The proof is when he battled Chedorlaomer and his 4 armies, taking 318 men against potentially 10 to 40,000, 50,000 men, and conquering him, finishing it, shutting down Chedorlaomer's alliance. Now, there's some relevance to the idea of a clan leader having absolute sovereignty, because I always teach the principle that in Hebrew thought, there has to be a subordinate in order for there to be a sovereign. Now, let me illustrate what I mean by that. A general who has the rank has been appointed and stands as the general is only as sovereign as the men who give him allegiance. So the army spends a significant amount of time, conditioning a man to understand rank and understand the chain of command and understand the sovereignty, as it were, of officers. Okay? So if someone outranks you, you are given orders. As long as it is a lawful order, you are within the context of sovereignty. But the only way a general is actually a general, and I know you've heard this from me before, is because his people lift him into that position. And that's where we get the idea of the people supporting the route, right? The people offering the allegiance, and therefore validating or officiating the title, right? Causing the title to become real. All right. And so when we have a prince, a priest, an elder, right? They are actually an authority, but only under the condition that there is absolute obedience. So in other words, as you honor the instruction of the sovereign, you are elevating them into the state of sovereignty, and therefore now there you have their favor. So the elders didn't get together and say, you shouldn't be elder, or you shouldn't be the clan leader, and you are actually out of line with this. No, that's not how it worked. And the elder could, or I mean, the clan leader could actually look at the situation and say, you know what, I don't really like how you made that decision. Let this happen, and it's done. It's finished. You have a problem with it? There's the gate to the camp, and miss you, right? So let me explain the principle behind the concept of these zakanim. By the time we get into the nation of Israel in Mitzrayim, the elders are a majority vote. Now, how is that different from the nomadic political system? The nomadic political system has a sovereign and elders who handle lesser problems, okay? So the elders are not a majority vote, and stare decisis is not a thing. The decision of a judge does not equate to the decision of the next judge, and that's stare decisis. If you have case law today, a judge in one court will look at that the ruling of another judge and stand by it because that judge ruled it. Now, they may make distinguishments from it and say, yeah, that doesn't necessarily apply here. But if it does, they'll stand by it. That's their decision. So anyways, the principle is that that's not present in the political system. And when I say political system, what I mean the decision makers. Okay. So in the ancient nomadic Hebrew lifestyle, there is no Senate. There is no vote. There are no lawmakers. Okay. So as we start to get into this, we have some interesting things occur, because eventually what we get to is this idea that even though that all of the Zakanim are on equal standing ground, all the elders are on equal standing ground, they don't actually have a vote per se. All right. Now, let's talk about where we see that actually manifest itself in Scripture. We actually see that in the rebellion of Korach. And although those parashas are yet to come, and therefore we don't want to enter a season before it's time, we'll comment really quick on the idea of Aaron's his rod budding. Okay. Aaron's rod buds, and now it's established that he is high priest, right? And that his bloodline will be the bloodline of the Kohanim. But you see the elders of Israel stand up against Moses and against Aaron, right? And they're saying, oh, we have a problem here. That don't jive in a nomadic lifestyle. In the nomadic lifestyle, it was simple. The clan leader who held the staff, the signet ring, and the cord was it. There was no vote. So we can see the Father shutting down democracy here in this little situation. Oh, we don't agree with your policy, Moses. We're gonna rise up and we're gonna say we're just as important as you. We're just as special as you. We're just as holy as you. Moses didn't shut that down. God did. Okay. We're going to get into this now. All right. So then there's this principle that in the wilderness, and of course, we're not going to enter too far into this parasha either, but in Yithro, in the wilderness, Moses is given instruction from his father-in-law to establish elders over tens, hundreds, fifties, thousands, and they would make decisions about the circumstances of the camp. And that was a reestablishment of the nomadic lifestyle, which the priest of Midian would have understood, because there's a derivative concept of the nomadic lifestyle present in the Midianites. Now, interestingly enough, as a function of that, we don't see Moses actually giving a sense of democracy to these men, but instead they're making decisions about smaller or minor issues. So the elders' job when they sat in the gate was not to establish a majority rule and therefore be the authority, because there was still supposed to be a clan leader. Okay. Now, what's interesting is this doesn't equate to a king. Why? Because what do we see in Samuel? We see in Samuel the people want a king. They don't have one. What they have is they have a mishpat. They have a judge. And that judge, a shafat. And that judge is actually a sovereign, as it were, but only as an agent of the clan leader. Okay? And so from that perspective, now we start to see this play out, that there wasn't supposed to be an actual sovereign here on earth, but instead a sovereign in heaven, potentially an agent or spokesperson, prophet for that sovereign in heaven. But there wasn't supposed to be an idea of an actual monarchy in the policies of these people. Now, the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle was definitely one in which it was a philosophy and not necessarily a physical carrying out of that. How do we know? Because they would build wells, they would put up walls to protect the sheep. They would build a wall around their vineyards or around their crops, right? They would establish themselves in a more permanent manner, but the mentality didn't change. And as we go into the idea, because what does the Father say? You will live in cities that you have not built, right? He knew they would be going into houses and not be in tents anymore. But the Hebraic nomadic lifestyle and philosophy was supposed to stand. Now, who do we see carrying that out? Who do we see being nomadic, not really having an established home and maintaining the lifestyle, philosophy, cultural, and political thought process of Abraham? Yeshua, right? Our Messiah. Your Messiah was a nomad. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we start to get into the concept of the church, which we're going to talk about that word in a second, we get into the concept of the church, what we'll find is that there is actually a deviation from this. All right. Now, in order to understand that in its whole, we're going to look at a word and we're going to look at that word in Hebrew, but I'm going to go straight to the board. We're going to kind of avoid the whole we're going to avoid the Strongs and the looking up of the verse and all that. We're going to just go straight to this word.